Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
We have to see the ways we have caused harm, which of course then opens us up to loss and to grief, and really breaks our heart when we look at some of the loss of species and ecosystems. In breaking our heart open, not only can we hold that grief and loss, it also gives us the capacity to hold more awe and wonder and beauty and delight.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Mary and Emma Kingsley, the mother and daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now, the farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in.
Hi, so today is the summer solstice.
Oh, yes. First full day of summer. It's the beginning of the summer season, yes.
Do you have any plans to celebrate?
Well, my plan is to sit in the yard tonight and have a bonfire with neighbors or friends or anybody that wants to come by and join me. I don't mind doing it by myself, and I would also welcome anyone that wants to be here. The summer solstice is something that really is not acknowledged that much in our culture these days. I think historically, or in recent history anyway, there might be some fear associated with celebrating the solstices and the equinoxes because it seems to be like connected with maybe pre-Christian traditions or earth-based traditions, which maybe are not perceived as being founded in the Judeo-Christian traditions that most of our culture is built on. But as we are talking to people like our guest today, we start to understand that the more we can cultivate these celebrations and connections with the rhythms of the earth and the cycles of the earth, the more we can bring about our own inner healing and healing of the earth and incorporate all of the traditions as well as a reverence for our home, our earth home.
So wherever you are, maybe you can have a community celebration, which just sort of leads into today's conversation, which we talk a lot about community, but a really encouraging conversation about how being in community and working towards connection to each other helps us engage with these really hard topics and issues.
Our guest is Leah Rampy. She's a writer and a speaker and a retreat leader who weaves ecology, spirituality, and personal practices to help others deepen their relationship to the natural world. She's the author of the award-winning book, Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos. And she's a frequent speaker on spiritual ecology and leadership.
She has led over a dozen pilgrimages to sacred places in the U.S. and internationally for the Shalom Institute for Spiritual Formation, where she was previously the executive director, and she is still a staff member there. She also founded and is a leader of the Church of Wild Two Rivers, which is affiliated with the Wild Church Network. They meet regularly to deepen spirituality through time in the natural world. She also offers retreats through Friends of Silence, a nonprofit honoring the work and intent of the late well-loved author Nan Merrill.
Leah lives with her husband in a co-housing community in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. This is a place where the members collaborated to build, and now they run their village with a focus on community, environmental responsibility, and earth care. She also co-founded Save Our Soil, which is a volunteer organization to promote soil health, local food, native plants, and regenerative agriculture in the Eastern Panhandle and beyond. The Rampys have 2 adult children who live in Virginia and 2 dogs who live at home with them.
I really love talking to Leah. And as you can tell, this co-housing community, super interesting.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by this idea, all these
Yeah.
different experiments of people living together in community and how it actually works or the ways in which it doesn't work. But it was so fun to talk to her and learn about her experience.
So here's Leah Rampy speaking to us today from Shepherdstown, West Virginia.
So my name is Leah Rampy, and I work as a retreat leader, writer, and speaker. Those are the things that I have come to do at this point in my life. I've had a lot of careers. I've been an educator over the years, teaching everything from public school to university. I've worked in corporations. I've worked at my own business, leading executive retreats and doing executive coaching and run a nonprofit. Along the way, I became really interested in climate change and what was happening, and got trained by Al Gore to do climate reality presentations. And I did some work with Biodiversity for a Livable Climate and got really into what they were doing. All of these have kind of converged for me into the retreats that I lead now. It's kind of this whole wonderful array of experience that felt like it was very distinct. And yet it was such a great learning for me to get to the place where I feel like my mission is to invite people to be more deeply connected with this living world. And that's the trajectory I'm on personally as well. How do I keep opening to those possibilities for reconnection?
Wow. And can you give us a brief overview of your latest book release?
So actually, I've written a lot of essays and more professional writing as well. But this is my first book. It's called Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos. And that just came out in February. And I'm working on a second book with a colleague of mine. It's The Spiritual Wisdom of Trees. And that will be published by Broadleaf Books 2025, even though that is due in a few weeks. So just finished one and almost finished a second one. My husband's been telling me for years that I need to write a book. It's funny how sometimes your discernment really comes from the mouths of others. And I kind of have a history. It's really quite funny to me. I'm off tomorrow actually to do a class on discernment. It's something I teach about. And yet there's so many occasions where I'm very poor at practicing what I preach. So he's been telling me I needed to write a book. And I think I just finally arrived at the time where everything came together for me and I felt a really compelling message. And truthfully, I felt like this is the conversation I want to be in for the rest of my life.
Oh, I love that so much. And so just to repeat your newly released book, Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos. Very, very compelling title. Let's dig into that a little bit. You've kind of told us about, laying the foundation for your writing it, but I'd love to hear you kind of get into it.
So I'm going to be clear that it is not a book about climate change, biodiversity loss. That's the background of the world we're living in. My sense is that we have to face into that directly to see the ways in which we have caused harm. So look at that very clear-eyed, be fully present to us, which of course then opens us up to loss and to grief and really breaks our heart when we look at some of the loss of species and ecosystems. And in breaking our heart open, not only can we hold that grief and loss, it also gives us the capacity to hold more awe and wonder and beauty and delight, to be more present and connected with the world around us on an ongoing basis. So I see that as a challenge that we face, to not want to look away, to not want to dull our connections. I think that forgetting how deeply we are connected has caused a lot of loneliness for many of us. So I'm hoping that through this book, we can be in these conversations about what that might look like.
This resonates with me so very deeply. And I want to ask you something that actually kind of just occurred to me. Do you think people that are a little older have more of this loss and grief because I know, speaking from my own experience, I am in my 60s. And as the years go by, my eyes are open more to the destruction and the warming and all of these things. I'm more aware of my sense of loss and grief over this. My own eco anxiety is the term we use. Do you think that's something that's more present for us that are older, more than younger generations that haven't had the years to observe the changes so it doesn't hit them as deeply?
My hunch, and Emma should weigh in on this too. One of the reasons I love that you two are doing this together is my daughter and I are in many of these conversations. She went off with me to get the training from Al Gore and the Climate Reality to do the slideshow, his Inconvenient Truth slideshow. So I have a really wonderful relationship with her, and I love mother-daughter teams. So I really love the fact that you bring both of those voices into your podcast. But let me say a little bit more clearly how I would answer your question. I do think that the baseline is continually changing. So let me give you an example. Just for a practice, I knitted what looks like a long scarf. It's part of what's called a tempestry project. They sell these kits on Etsy. Each of the rows represents a year. And you knit in various colors that show deviation from the mean temperature over the years. So I have this long scarf that starts with very deep blue and ends up with very deep red. I put little tags on to represent where my grandparents were born, my parents, my husband and I, our children. And what you can readily see when you look at that is that our kids do not know the world we lived in. The temperature has never been that array for them that it was, say, for my husband and me, because we've lived through some pretty blue years, and theirs is pretty pink to deep red. That's true, I think, for the biodiversity loss. We look at, there are many studies about how many birds we've lost, a third to a half of our songbirds in the U.S. since 1970. I was alive in 1970. I remember what that was like. We hear people talk about the insects on the windscreens, and we remember when we were small driving in the country and there would be many, many, and now there are significantly fewer because we've had such a devastating loss of insects. So that baseline keeps changing. And it's kind of like that horrible, I think, analogy of boiling a frog or whatever, that you don't get it when the water's being heated very slowly. Grief and loss is certainly very present for young adults who feel and speak boldly about how their future is deeply compromised by the choices that we have made in our generations preceding. I don't know where you would come in on that, Emma.
So talking about the experience over time and that changing baseline, I don't know. And I'd be so interested to talk to someone even younger than myself. But my experience has been, I can remember maybe more snow in my childhood, but also I moved around a little bit from areas that had snow to less snow, back to areas that have more snow. So that's a little harder to gauge. But what my observation would be, the conversation and the consciousness around it being, my mom has always been someone who has cared about the environment and climate change and been really aware of it. And so when I was younger, that was definitely more of a fringe way of thinking, and being concerned about it was very weird or not normal. And watching that evolution to it becoming really maybe not in every single case, but I see it now. It's not even a partisan issue anymore. It's a reality that everyone has accepted. And the way that it's really even infiltrated, the way that people are just so aware of it, and that it's just generally agreed upon that it is a thing that we should all care about. That has been, in my lifetime, a big shift.
I agree so much with you, Emma, about how now it's on the sort of collective radar more. We know about it. There are buzzwords, there are reports, there are articles. But on the wider scale, I feel like it's more of an intellectual or cerebral understanding. And that the more we can tap in to this loss and grief and these things that you're writing about in your book and your essays, the more our behavior will really change. And many of the conversations that we have here on this program, we talk about how once you really let your heart break open to the reality of it, and you speak in these terms too, like just really facing it, facing directly, look what's happened, look what's transpiring as we speak. This is not like 50 years in the future anymore. This is happening now. So then you feel it. And that's where the behavior changes. And so that's why your work and what you're talking about, I think is so very, very essential. We need to spread the news and give the statistics and talk about the facts and what's happening. But we also need to lead people to like really look at it directly with their hearts as well as their minds. Just very recently, I was together, my little monthly podcast, The Slow Living Through the Seasons, where I take each month and I just do some reflections on it. In that process of putting that together, I had a very strong memory of a family tradition in our house. I was the only girl with two brothers, and my dad would take me out in the garden on Easter morning and take my many pictures, hundreds of pictures, picking the daffodils. We called them jonquils. So it was the jonquil photo session. And we know from the timing of Easter, which is after the first full moon, after the spring equinox, that earliest spring would be late March. And the daffodils would have been in full bloom, and it would have been very, very cold. I remember standing out there so many Easter mornings, just really freezing. And now the daffodils are blooming maybe mid to late February. And that kind of hit me kind of hard, like, wow, this is in my lifetime. I'm just really seeing this right there in front of me, right there in my own experience. And here we are still, I guess, a couple of weeks from Easter, and the daffodils are waning.
No, I think that's absolutely true. There was just a map I saw in the news today showing the earlier spring times across the U.S. And of course, we know our garden zones have changed. I mean, we're in a different zone. And so it is different. Those festivals that counted on certain flowers to be blooming have to change.
Yes, the Cherry Blossom Festival in Washington, D.C. I don't know what's happening this year, but in lots of recent years, cherry blossoms are quite done by the time people are flocking to town to see them. I think they're adjusting that over the, beginning to see the trends too, and they make it earlier. But it used to be April, and now it's always March.
I want to pick up on something you said that I think is really important, and that is you mentioned opening the heart too. I think we're so busy that we often run around tied up in our mind thinking about what's next and what's next and what's next and what do I have to do and what's on my grocery list and what will I fix for dinner and what are the 3 calls I need to make. And so I think we walk by a lot of beauty in the living world that I think is trying to get our attention and has some wonderful awe and wonder and delight to offer us. But when we are only in that mind place, our thinking mind, it's much, much more difficult for us to see. So I would say absolutely yes to heart and also to senses, to fully open our senses. That is not a habit that we have continued to cultivate. You think about our ancestors, and of course they had to cultivate their senses. They had to do that to be safe or to find food or to be fully alive. We are living in ways that don't require that. And so I think we miss a tremendous amount of the beauty and the wisdom of the world around us because we're not tasting, we're not touching, we're not observing, we're not hearing.
And I just had a thought, in a way, we're also shielded. We don't have to experience some of the harshness and some of the pain of when the things are frozen over. And so we can't have access to that particular food. I think part of the problem is we don't have to feel them. We don't have to deal with them in our everyday because we don't interact with them.
And we have, in fact, gone to great lengths to separate ourselves from the outdoors because of the discomfort or the inconvenience. And, over time, as we've evolved into our civilization or our way of life, we've done a very good job of disconnecting ourselves from it, which brings me to something else I'd love to talk to you about. We talk a lot about exploring our connection to nature when in fact we are nature and we know that we are of flesh and blood. But the only language we have really to frame that is we're connected to nature. But I would argue, and I've made this argument before on this program, that very language perpetuates that disconnection because we can't accomplish what we need to accomplish simply by making sure we get the kids to the park on the weekend or even getting out into the garden. Yes, that affirms our connection. It's very important to do that. But again, it's kind of keeping it in the head level, like, oh, I went outside for an hour today.
First of all, it's really frustrating that the word nature itself is defined as what's not human or not civilization.
Yes.
That's the definition. So then we start talking about being in nature. It's an othering. And I think when we other something, then it's easier to slip into that language about owning or using, or it's a resource. And we do that with people as well. So once we slip into that, something that is savage or uncivilized becomes a way to distance us from something or someone that feeds greed or consumption. I used to work in human resources. What the heck is that about when you start looking at that? What kind of term is that, pray tell? So I think you're absolutely right. First of all, I want to be clear that even though I talk about reconnecting, we can't ever disconnect. I mean, we are within this living world. Try doing without it for a little bit. How about air and water and food? This is clearly not possible, but we can live in a way as if we are not connected. We can choose not to notice, be grateful for, reciprocate all of those gifts, right? So part of what I'm about is trying to oh, wait, let's remember that belonging that's so important. So yes, I think absolutely, Mary, absolutely.
That reminds me of a quote from your book. Why does the paradigm of human superiority still hold sway in our Western culture? And I wonder is that a question you're asking, or is that something that you feel like you were able to answer in your book?
Well, so I learned a lot writing this book. I suspect we always do in any of these kinds of projects that we take on. You start out thinking you have some ideas, and then when you're actually writing them down, you're thinking, is that really true? I'm looking at it on paper. Do I believe that? So I think I'm getting better at the questions. I'm not so sure I'm getting better at the answers. I do think that human exceptionalism holds sway in part because if we didn't believe that, we will have to give up a lot.
The infrastructure that we operate within assumes this human superiority. We don't have to follow the rules. Human beings are above the rules. Human beings don't have to live in the cycles of nature. We don't have to keep the balance. We don't have to adjust our consumption so as not to deplete resources because we've found ways all around that. A lot of us, and a growing number of us, would like to escape it. We would like to do it differently. And we talk a lot on here about we can't escape our systems, but we can, I think, take a step back from them. We can observe them. And we can begin to make different decisions. Very tiny example in the whole big picture is, okay, I'm going to not use plastic because we all know that plastic is not a good thing. So just try that for a day. You can hardly touch anything. There's very little you can eat. You can't prepare anything.
There go my
you can't make any phone calls.
glasses. There goes the microphones.
This whole thing we're doing, that's the recording. It just unveils how steeped we are in it. Circling back to that question of why does the paradigm of human superiority still hold sway in our Western culture? Where do you go with that in the book, if you could remember?
Well, so I just want to say it's so funny you said plastic because I just did a book talk a couple of days ago and I didn't get one single softball question. Every question was like, so what do we do and how will we live? I mean, the big answers. And I said, you can't look to me. I can't even figure out how to eliminate plastic, and we know we're breathing it and we're drinking it and all of that. Two things I want to see. One is the long view. I don't believe that you and I together, Mary, will make such a significant change in our lifetimes that it will be totally different for our daughters. But I do believe that we can make some changes. And that's, I think, what you're saying. Where do you start? What do you start noticing? That's one thing. So that you are, in fact, leaving stepping stones or moving a little bit further along the path that might eventually lead us to greater mutual well-being. And if I hold greater mutual well-being as sort of my marker, then what are the things I do that help collectively move us in that way? The second thing I would say about that is none of us can do everything and we're not supposed to. So I think part of it is, this is the soul part of the title. What is the gift that I've been given? What is the true essence of who I am and how I am invited to be in this particular time? How do I use that gift to the maximum to do what is mine to do? And that's where discernment comes in as well. So none of us individually or even collectively are going to save the world, so to speak. And yet I think we have a piece of the puzzle. And so that's what we can play, is like, where is my puzzle piece going to go? We remember that Earth herself has so much agency and wisdom and animacy. And part of it is also trusting that if we can listen more deeply, that we can align our lives better with where Earth is going. And maybe that's only our little particular part of the Earth that we can see. Maybe that's simply our backyard. If we were all working in our backyards, that could be really beautiful.
That's a place to start. And if you don't have a backyard?
Absolutely. And you can join in with people who are in your local parks or who are doing little islands along the roadways. I mean, there's many ways. Picking up the turtles who are trying to cross the road.
Oh, yes. The worms. I like to get the worms.
I write in my book that I walked out one morning and my neighbors were picking up the worms. You know how they come out to breathe during a heavy rainstorm. And they were picking them up and carrying them over. It's a testament to how desperately we have wanted those worms to support us. I live in a co-housing community that is built about 5 years ago, and we're on compacted clay. And so we have a real concerted effort to try to build up the soil.
Would love to hear you talk about this co-housing community and how it works.
Well, the co-housing is quite a movement across the U.S. And so we are not alone. We are the only co-housing community right now in West Virginia, but in the greater metro DC area, there are several. Different co-housing communities have different intentions. Our values are focused around community, around earth care, helping each other to age vibrantly and connecting with the town and the world, the broader world around us. So we have worked together to identify what kind of community we wanted to build, and then to hire our contractor and our builders. In a way, that's easier than living here, to imagine what could be. Now we're 5 years in to living together, and we have teams who do the work, and we make all our decisions together. So we built in the town limits of Shepherdstown. We built on 19 acres and then clustered our homes right along the edge of that. So we have about 8 acres that are in conservation area and another few acres that we sold off for other duplexes. We have 30 units, duplex and triplex, and a common garden where there's a team that works with the meals team that coordinates the preparation of meals that we have together once a week. They try to grow what the meals team says they would like to use to cook and serve. That's just kind of like a little tiny step toward the way life used to be, where you were growing what you would be eating, is a little tiny step toward that. And then we have teams that take care of our trails and our conservation area and the general landscaping. We have a group that is not part of our co-housing community per se, except that it was started by a group of us who are in this community and bringing in others, called Save Our Soil. And we are very focused right now on Lawns to Life, inviting people to take, ours is their postage stamp lawns, but inviting them to transform from grass to native plants to feed people and all the critters, and supporting local food, encouraging regenerative farmers, who may be nearby, supporting farmers market and other small shops that buy locally. So it's really a wonderful place. I was going to mention when we talked about that isolation earlier and isolating ourselves, Emma, from buffering ourselves from the heat and the cold and all of that. We made a decision to build our carports at around the periphery. So we have to walk to get to them. So that's two things. You got to be outside and you're usually passing your neighbors. So we see each other and we're connected. Our mail gets delivered into our common house, the mail room. So you got to go get your mail. So it's a concerted effort. Our front porches are very close together. And so if somebody's on the front porch, they're fair game for conversation. If they set out in their back porch, then we ignore them.
What is this community called?
Shepherd Village.
Okay. And it's specifically co-housing. Is this different from intentional community or a commune?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not a commune in the sense that we own our own homes free and clear. We could do everything in our own home. I mean, all of our cooking, our laundry, all that kind of stuff. But we choose to share tools and gardens.
Brilliant.
So is there a common tool shed and all that?
Woodworking shop. We have some women who built picnic tables and benches for the community. But you could also go there and do your own project. There's a media room. You can go in and sit and watch television with other people if you want to. So, it's not an enormous step in living more simply, but it's certainly a significant step. Most of us had pretty serious downsizing to move here.
Yeah, what's the average size of the units? Like a couple of bedrooms, 3 bedrooms,
1 to 2
what is it?
bedroom, 2 bath, and the living space all on the ground floor. And then many of the units like ours, we have a loft.
And it's generally, I'm checking out the website right now. Is it generally ages 55 and older?
Just ours is that, but we are designated a senior living community, which means that 80% of our homes have to have someone who's 55 and older living in them.
Okay. And do you miss that age diversity, or is that
both?
I can see?
Yeah. I think people love it when the grandkids come around, or somebody's family comes. They like that energy. And then there's a commonality of interests as well.
Yes, everybody could gather in the common room. So this sounds so interesting and fascinating, and so many things about it just sort of makes sense, like no-brainer stuff. So when you have your common meal once a week, that is going to be the food that y'all grew. Mostly, exclusively, or is that kind of a loose ruler?
Yeah, it's very loose. It's like we try to use out of our garden.
Yeah.
And if not, some of us have individual gardens as well, or individual plots. And for a while, the meals team was saying, if you put a little sticker on here if it came from our community garden, and a different color if it came from your own, and another one if it came locally. So it's just no penalty, no requirement. It's a HOA by West Virginia law. So we have to have people who are designated to be on a board. But really, our meetings are whole community meetings.
It's so interesting how many times on the podcast we've had folks, unintentionally this has happened, that are involved in various forms of alternative living communities. And that actually just makes a lot of sense for folks interested in this conversation. It all comes down to the ways that our systems are set up and the ways that we participate in those systems and our everyday life, the way we go through life every day to fulfill our daily needs. And it's so basic and can just change everything. Like you said, even from the simplest, not parking your car in an enclosed room attached to your house, to not having a car, to having a doorman, to the shared mailroom.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, one of the things that I'm intrigued by is the epidemic of loneliness. And, our Surgeon General has written about that. And there's all sorts of studies about how loneliness is equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. I mean, you die from loneliness, really. And I think that there's loneliness in terms of being disconnected from other people. I think there's also loneliness that we don't really understand where it comes from, but it's in being disconnected to the living world around us. And so I think there's two forms of disconnection that really sadden us and cause us a lot of grief to feel that level of disconnection. That's one thing that intentional communities offer, is an easy way to stay connected to people. And some, like ours, also an easy way to stay connected to gardening or trail work or whatever you want to do. I really benefited from finding like-hearted people who care about the living world. One of the women here, she and I run retreats together that are spiritual centered retreats. They're outside. They're about inviting people into maintaining their love with the land and the trees and the living world. And we started what we dubbed Earth Group almost 5 years ago. There's a book group to meet once a month. And we started out with Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And we spent a year reading that book. You will find her words all over my writing because I've actually taught her book 3 times and just find her to be an incredible wisdom elder, even though she's younger than I am, I'm sure, but she's an elder in her wisdom. So that's a very important thing as a writer in this domain about earth and soul, to have a group of people who are willing to read it and give me feedback and who are in conversations about similar books and topics. So I feel really grateful for that.
I love that you use the word hearted. The word that's tossed around a lot is like minded. And even at Lady Farmer, we've used that word a lot and we've kind of tried to not use it as much because we've decided that maybe we don't want to be only around like-minded people, that maybe that's not the most productive. But I do like the like-hearted seems more.
I do too. That jumped out at me. I'm feeling like the term like-minded sort of leads to being in your own little silo, just talking about affirming each other's opinions. And we have enough of that on social media, but to be in a real community that your actions and your decisions are coming from this place in your heart, a place of love and respect. And I like that. That jumped out at me too, Emma. It's so easy to use and people use it all the time. They sort of toss it around, but something you've touched on a couple of times, what you just said, and you read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she speaks from a place of this native indigenous wisdom, which is something for all of us to look at because so much of it is ancient, pre-industrial. It's when people did live in constant communion with the earth and they had to feel it and interact with it and engage with it because that's how they live. So so often now we speak about indigeneity and going back and looking at those ways and so forth. But there's another quote of yours. I can't say if it came from the book or somewhere on your website. The quote is, "If our family belongs to generations of wanderers, can we possibly be indigenous to the place we find ourselves?" That is something that has really got me thinking. So what is my own indigeneity? Where does that leave me?
And if I like how you just said the place where we find ourselves, because are we supposed to just go back to where we're all indigenous to? That seems impractical as well. And I think there's got to be a way to connect to where we are
without cultural appropriation or things that are seen as not ideal.
Something, even if that's how we got here in the first place.
Complicated. And even those of us who maybe have been here for generations, our ancestors may have been forced off the land they live in Scotland or Ireland or wherever, in Italy. So I'm going to say a couple of things and also say I don't know, but I did spend a fair amount of time writing around that topic as a way to try to understand it. Because when I looked back at what I could find in my family history, the word I used is unsettled. They weren't settlers. They were unsettled and they just kept moving and moving and moving. And they might have lived in one place for several generations, but then westward they would go. So Robin Wall Kimmerer says something to the effect, this is not the exact quote, but something to the effect, if we live in the land as if we depended on it and our future generations depend on it, we can become indigenous to it. So then just recently I heard, and I don't know to whom to attribute this, but I heard this just little quote that dropped in to a much larger conversation. We're all indigenous to Earth. Well, yeah. And so I'm thinking, well, what do I do with the place I am living? So how do I get to know it better? And it's true. I can't go back to say that I have childhood memories of the place in which I live now. I grew up in the middle of Kansas and vast open spaces and a land altered significantly by the plow, by farms. So we're all living in altered land. That's one thing. There's very little. I think there's 3% of the world is ecologically intact and 7% is functionally intact, meaning the basic species that live there can continue. And 80% of those lands that are intact are indigenous managed lands. So think the places that are left in the Amazon and the Congo forests. We do what we can with where we are, I think, which means a lot of listening. What is wanted now from this land? And that's a conversation in our conservation area, for instance. I mean, whatever you have outside of your door, it's the same conversation. Like, is this land wanting to revert to bringing on some species who lived here long ago? Or has the land and the soil so altered itself? It's not the community in which that tree lived a century ago. So there's a lot of collective listening, I think, that has to go on to try to be in collaboration with the world and acknowledging the peoples who were here before and what they have lost. So that's a little rambling because I think we're all trying to figure that out. I don't think there's a good, how we live in this.
There's no tips and tricks.
Right.
Oh, no. Well, I think to me, my takeaway from what you just said, the focal point is we're all indigenous to Earth, and every human can claim that. And we all, no matter where you are on the planet, when you do connect yourself with the seasons and the transitions through the year, you're doing that with every other living thing on the planet. We're all riding together on this sweet Earth. And we put all kinds of rituals and doctrines and stuff on top of what's happening around us, but doesn't remove us from the fact that basic thing is that we're all inhabitants here and we are going through the transitions of the Earth. So that's a real guidepost to me, a way of connecting. One more thing I wanted to ask you about before we get into our closing questions here. I was delighted to find that you're involved with Church of the Wild.
Oh, yes.
And I'd love to hear you talk about that. I've been fascinated with that for a very long time.
We are loosely affiliated with the Wild Church Network, and they are all over the U.S. and Canada. And what they have in common, of course, is this sense of being out in the wild and attending to spirituality through time in the living world. What we do in Church of the Wild, Two Rivers, that I founded almost 5 years ago now, is we meet monthly. And our intention is to create community in real time, both community of people and community of all of the living world around us. We meet outside. We have a theme each month. But the important piece of what we do together is we spend 40 minutes in silence, wandering or sitting with the land, the trees, the world around us. And then we do a little sharing together. So this is an opportunity. It's kind of creating a space apart for us to pause and breathe and together support each other in this process of reconnecting, loving more deeply, tuning our senses, being really aware. And there's something, I don't know if either of you practice meditation, but to me, there's always something when you're sitting with others. There's a depth in the silence. It's as if I am aided by the intentions of others. And I think that's true as well when we're out in the world together and we're just holding that intention of being more aware, listening, learning from the beings around us and appreciating those gifts that we get. So it's a practice, basically, that we do together once a month.
I'm fascinated by it, and I'm expect to see me there. Do you just show up, or do you have to sign up or register?
I ask people to sign up just in case there are changes. I do it on Eventbrite, and we're always the first Sunday of the month. And you could find us on Eventbrite, but we have a website, Church of the Wild Two Rivers, with them too. And yeah, so just people do show up and people sign up and don't show up. And it's all good. It's one of those, whoever's there is,
we know how that goes.
Exactly who's supposed to be there.
Yeah. And then do you share a meal or does everybody just disperse? Or
we used to share snacks before COVID. And then, of course, ironically, we did a little bit on Zoom in the first days of COVID, but then we could go ahead and meet during COVID.
Because you're outside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What a relief that was, I guess, to your members.
We just distanced our chairs.
Sure.
So it's very flexible. I mean, you said members, but I don't think anybody probably considers themselves a member per se in the sense that we often think of membership. I go to Church of the Wild.
How beautiful that there's no building fund.
No, there is not. We don't charge even. We take up a donation to pay for the retreat center center where we meet.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful.
I would love to hear a little
Okay.
bit too, before we wrap up, about your retreats.
So they're all on my website. I say cleverly called leahrampy.com. I have a variety of retreats that I do throughout the year. My husband and I co-lead one called Singing the Trees, and it's a long weekend retreat, and we do chant and simple song in addition to being together. And then I show up where other people invite me. So I'll be at Prairie Woods Franciscan Conference Center in Iowa, and I'll be doing some local retreats throughout the year. My colleague, Beth Norcross, who founded the Center for Spirituality in Nature, where I do a lot of work, she and I are working on a book called The Spiritual Wisdom of Trees. We developed the class together, and it was filmed by an award-winning videographer, Jane Pittman. And so we taught it as a video class, or one where you watch independently, but then zoom in with us and we all talk together about it. But we are doing a retreat at Montreat Conference Center in North Carolina. Usually we do a Bridget retreat every February.
Oh,
I think I heard you mention Bridget.
absolutely. She's sort of our claimed
Yeah.
saint of Lady Farmer, because there's a lot in what we're doing, what we're talking about, and what we believe and feel, and that Bridget's just,
Yeah.
right in
Well,
there.
certainly
with
the
all of it.
Celtic had that, that whole Celtic spirituality had those deep connections to the land. And you saw I led retreats. I mean, pilgrimages. I've led a lot of pilgrimages to the island of Iona, the coast of Scotland. So she's near and dear to my heart as well.
Oh my goodness. And you have been involved with the
Mhm.
Shalem
Yes.
Institute?
I've done a number of classes there. That's actually where I'm going tomorrow to lead a discernment class. But I was the executive director there for 6 years, which was really an important formative time for me to be engaged with those wonderful people who were there.
And my cousin, Kathy Spar, was very involved with that organization.
I
Yes.
do. Yeah.
She's my first cousin. And we interviewed her of Bridget
Yeah.
episode.
Oh
2
my
or 3
gosh.
years
I haven't
ago,
seen
so,
her in
yeah.
years and years, but yes, I do remember her. Oh, how cool.
Also, are you familiar with Mary DeYoung? She does Iona pilgrimages as well and does a lot of writing. Really be interested in her stuff. So, Leah, what does slow living mean to you, and how do you experience it in your daily life?
Well, first of all, I like the question in part because I think it's always important to be reminded that that's a possibility. And for me, that means coming to my senses. And I mean that in a very literal sense of coming to my senses, taking the deep breath that allows me to be attuned to what is around me. When I can pause and sink into my senses, then it changes everything. All of a sudden, I'm not making decisions out of my head alone or out of my ego. It allows me to drop into heart space too.
Oh, thank you. I think that is the first time that has ever come up as an answer to this question that I can remember. Coming to my senses. I love that very much. Thank you. And another question we ask all of our guests is, what does the good dirt mean to you in terms of either literally in your life or as a metaphor?
Yeah, rich soil, full of life, way beyond our capacity to comprehend. And certainly we don't understand all of that life. And it's so connected. I mean, as we write about trees, you can't not write about that fungal network that assists in all of the sharing of resources and the nutrients that are exchanged and the way in which collaboration and connection is happening. So good dirt. And it's also the ground of our being. I mean, it's really in many religious traditions, it is how we are grounded. And grounding figuratively is so important as well. I mean, I think to me, the grounding goes along with the whole open the senses, ground yourself, feel your feet on this ground and, let it speak to you. So good dirt, I'm all about.
So my eyes and heart were opened so enormously to the connections amongst trees by Suzanne Simard's book, which
Yes.
you reference in your book, I believe.
She's in there too.
Yes. And that was just so profound. And she came to that as really a scientist that opened up to that very sacred nature of science, really.
Well, I think science is such a gateway to awe and wonder as well. It can take us into a different place. It can take us, if we're not attentive to all about head and figuring out and knowing in a particular way. I think it also opens us to knowing in a way that's beyond the head game that we often want to play about trying to understand how things work. Wow, look what they do, these birch and fir trees, and how they support each other. Pretty amazing.
What would you like to leave the audience with today? What takeaway, or what would you like listeners to most understand about the work that you're doing?
So I guess two things come to mind. We haven't mentioned the wonderful Joanna Macy. Her words just really stay with me. It's all alive. It's all connected. It's all intelligent. It's all relatives. And I am often asked where I find hope. I want to be really careful about that word because I think sometimes we think that hope comes from someplace outside of us and it's given to us, because you said X, Emma, I now feel hope. Mm-hmm. I think hope is tricky that way when we are waiting on somebody else to deliver it to us. I also think that we can go the other way and say, well, there is none. It's all despair. The world is bleak. Our hearts know better. And when we can tune into our hearts and listen to the dreams that are unfolding in the world around us, and we can step into that and take that long view, knowing that it may not all happen in our lifetime. We can start walking on a path of trusting that this incredibly wise earth is also collaborating, and we don't have to do it all by ourselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for the gift of your book that was just released in February, Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos, and for all of your other writings, essays, retreats, collaborations, all these things that are helping all of us come to a better understanding of our, we say connection to the earth, but really it's our kinship. But what is the word that dissolves that idea of separateness?
Well, for sure, oneness.
Oneness. I think of a fish doesn't say
I'm connected to water.
We live within Earth. And these are tricky because, it's all a paradox, isn't it? But we are unique.
Exactly.
And we are deeply, deeply within and a part of.
Yes, that's true. Thank you so much. I love this conversation very much. And I look forward to meeting you in person.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy we finally connected.
Oh, thank you both. And thank you for using your gifts of bringing people together in this way.
For tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. We love hearing from you. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer, a slow living lifestyle community, and the original music is composed and performed by John Kingsley.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at WeAreLadyFarmer. That's WeAreLadyFarmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.
Goodbye.